Hello and welcome to Lakes Chat. I'm your host, Jennifer Caddick with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. In today's episode, we're chatting with Ed Verhamme, Principal and Senior Engineer with LimnoTech. He oversees a network of buoys and sensors around the Great Lakes that support boaters, fishermen, search and rescue crews, weather forecasters, drinking water treatment plant operators, and nuclear power plants to help them understand weather, waves, and water quality conditions on the lakes. He's also the past president of the International Association of Great Lakes Researchers. He's been involved in dozens of Great Lakes and other large lake projects that push the limits of technology and innovative research and development. Welcome, Ed. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. This is great.
So I'm really excited to nerd out about the lakes and buoys with you today. But I think some of our listeners are probably thinking like, buoys? Like what's the big deal? Why worry about this? Because I think those buoys are things that most of us will never interact with directly, but they can impact our daily life. You know, they help those water treatment plant operators make sure our water is safe. They help us have a safe day boating. So describe the big picture. You know, what is this network and why is it important?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think just stepping back to the Great Lakes, the sheer size, it's hard to keep remembering how big they are. And I think if you're on the lakes every day, you know this tiny little area you go or how far across the lakes are. I think, I'm in Ann Arbor here now, and the longer you're away from them, the smaller they seem to get in size. So I think I'm always just reminded by how vast and large they are. And they're a huge resource. I mean, it's an unparalleled global resource that we use for drinking water, tons of commerce. I mean, the sort of shipping that happens on the Great Lakes commercially, as well as the recreational boating and the commercial fishery. It's just an unparalleled global resource. So when you think about in our information age, how much we try and understand, traffic and, what's the weather today, so I can do I need a coat for my kids? So there's this sort of parallel decision process that's happening when people that are working on the water, whether it's boating, fishing, driving a commercial freighter, and the amount of data they have, it's surprisingly little. We make very few observations of the Great Lakes, waves, winds. We're mostly relying on these projections of, well, it's this windy onshore, so it must be this windy offshore. And I think our modeling, our ability to use computer models to understand what's happening on the lake, if we're not measuring it, it's certainly gotten better, but those models are wrong. They need to be fixed. They're not seeing this one storm system moving across. We haven't the first substantial investment we had in observing the Great Lakes is the year after the Edmund Fitzgerald sank. That was one of the largest investments in observing in the Great Lakes. And it's, for all the advanced tech they had in the 1970s, they weren't monitoring the lakes, and they could have been. So I think we've only seen these sort of periodic large reinvestments in monitoring. The most recent is concerning drinking water and understanding, after the Toledo water crisis and even portions of the Flint water crisis, what's going on with water affects millions of people almost instantly. So I think these sort of reminders of the value of water, I'm always interested in how we can use the available technology and grow the number of observations.
Yeah, and it seems to me like when I was reading up on this network that there's been some really big technology changes in like the past decade or so that has helped you and your team and everybody who works on this project vastly expand this network. So explain to us a little bit about what it was like before, back in, say, the 70s when they were first starting to deploy some of this on the water technology, and what's changed a little bit.
Yeah, one of the biggest, I mean, we've always had, going back to even the 30s and 40s, like technology to monitor water has always been advancing at some, rate of, like how do we measure currents or how do we measure waves? And then how does that data actually get transmitted to, I'd say, the internet. I mean, what we know is the internet today. Back then it was, how do you log it to a paper log, or how do you save it to a onboard disk that you can retrieve later. So as we've seen the just computer sector, technology sector increase that capability of a self-logging instrument, we've thought about, well, how does that data actually leave that buoy in near real time and go to another set of users that aren't on the lake right now or are nearby and want to know what that data is. They don't want to wait till someone downloads it. So there's kind of been this parallel track development between, I say, scientific understanding of the lakes as well as this operational use of it. And that's kind of, you get to the 70s with Edmund Fitzgerald. It's like, it's great we had a wave model of the lakes, but if that information of the waves right now on the eastern end of Lake Superior can't be transmitted to that boat, then we're still missing a whole nother value and risk proposition for how to use technology. So we've also, just as we've advanced the cell phone technology in our pockets, we've had at our disposal some of that same technology with smaller, less power and more options for getting data to the internet. So that's what's really accelerated it in the last 10 years, is that borrowing of technology, and that, we don't have a million buoys on the Great Lakes. It's not like these things are produced in ginormous quantities. So we're always in a lower quantity, trying to weed through what's available. I mean, I had a presentation once that it just strapped a cell phone to a life jacket. I mean, that's like super technology packed, and we don't have that. So anyway, that's just a tiny look at how technology gets into buoys.
Yeah. And can you describe for us, and we'll put up on our website, there's some great blogs that show these and show you and your team like deploying them, but describe for our listeners, like how tall, like what does it actually look like if you were to like come upon one out on the lakes? Like what would somebody see out there?
Yeah, some of the original buoys that they put out in the 1970s are still actually deployed to this day. They're huge, 10-foot across, or I'm sorry, they're a 10-meter discus buoy, which is 30 feet across. And some of the ones, smaller ones, are only 10 feet across. So these are massive steel structures that have like a half donut or a half a circle hull to it. Those take a big Coast Guard cutter to deploy. The ones that we work with and put closer to shore, it looks like a spacecraft, I'd say. It's got a cone shape. It's made out of fiberglass, and these are the ones that we started putting out about 10 years ago. It just got a weird instrument mast on it. It's trying to be about as small as it can be, with hosting quite a bit of scientific instruments as well as radios and some web cameras. The ones that we put out this year can almost just be thrown out of the boat. They're made out of foam.
Wow.
They have some solar panels on top, which are power the whole thing. So you'd notice it. You'd be like, wow, there's something going on with that small yellow floating thing. And we're generally, these buoys aren't marking navigation hazards, so they kind of pop up in places where you're like, why is that there? And it's generally near some populated area or water intake. So
Yeah. And most of those, you're also probably, now that I'm thinking about this, right? You're probably bringing them in the winter. They don't, unless it's one of those big stationary, they're right, because they can't.
No, they all come in. All the buoys, almost
Yeah.
every buoy on the Great Lakes has to come in the winter, and this is sort of our, northern freshwater lakes all freeze, and so we do have to take them in every year.
Yeah. And so, I'm fascinated by this, like the idea that we have, you mentioned this before, we have this onshore information, but sometimes we don't really know what's happening on one of the lakes in real time. And so, from my understanding, there's kind of two big-ish buckets of data that these buoys are collecting. There's kind of the meteorological stuff, weather, wave heights, et cetera. And then some are collecting water quality data, and some are collecting all the above. So I want to kind of dig into those two buckets. So let's start with this meteorological data. Like, tell us a little bit more about what is collected and how's it used? How's that information used from a meteorology standpoint?
Yeah, so we look at wind speeds, wind direction. That's the the driving force that's building waves. So if you know the winds, you can generally get an idea of what the waves are going to look like. And when we think about the open waters of the Great Lakes and some major cities, measuring wind speed on water, and this just happened the other day. You think about storms moving from Milwaukee and are going to slam into West Michigan. The buoy is going to be the first point that you're measuring wind speeds before those winds slam into the shoreline. So I think we're able to use them as this pre-storm warning system of, hey, there's 60-mile-an-hour straight winds coming right at the shoreline. They're also measuring air temperature, which when you look at how we calculate lake evaporation, it's really dependent on what's the air temperature and water temperature differential. When you're thinking about that, if you're in Traverse City and it's 60 degrees and it's 90 degrees further inland toward Cadillac, that lake is the problem. These lakes create their own weather. So I think we're mostly trying to use that data to warn people in real time of what's happening, but also drive those forecast models, which are very dependent on that offshore onshore difference. We're also measuring barometric pressure, so we can see when the real driver of wind is pressure differences, so he can understand that pressure differential. And solar radiation is something we measure, how sunny it is. So if you're trying to think about growth of algae, warming of water from solar radiation, you're going to want to understand sunlight.
And so tell us a little bit about the water quality data part, right? Like, I know you mentioned the Toledo water crisis, and my impression is that drove the deployment of some buoys out there. Like, what kinds of data, water quality data, are you collecting, and how is that used? And is it location specific, or are you collecting the same kinds of data across all your buoys, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think, when you think about the Great Lakes, there's going to be certain parts that are going to have more problems with one issue than another area of the Great Lakes. So Lake Erie, you're going to think algal blooms. So you're going to want to measure chlorophyll, which is the more scientific term, but it's just how green the water is. How green does it look? We're also measuring how brown the water is with suspended sediment and turbidity. So I think these sensors are trying to capture some larger scale phenomenon, like where is this massive algal bloom? Is it at this location right now? And is the intensity or concentration changing? So we generally tailor, these are more expensive instruments. They're made in even much lower volume than the atmospheric ones that I mentioned earlier. So these are very specialized. They're fancy optical instruments, shining lights and reflecting back into the lens. And they also have a wiper that keeps this optical window clear. So they're pretty high tech, but they're really valuable in relaying that quality of the water. And it's, we should watch what we think about when we think quality. More green doesn't mean poor quality. It just means there's more things living in it. And sometimes those things can be harmful. So we're trying to use instruments that scientists would use, and then feed these data streams in that informed people can use this data and pair it with toxin measurements to say, oh, it's green and it's toxic. So there's some co-use of this data. So I just watch that word quality, because people generally think in terms of water quality of their tap water, like, can I drink the water? And there's a real decoupling once we get out into just the looking at the lakes. So
sure. And you've sort of alluded to this. Obviously you all aren't doing this by yourselves. It's not just you out there dumping these buoys into the lakes. You've got a big team, and you're working with a lot of different partners. So tell us a bit about the partnerships, and I don't know if you have a good example, like, that make the deployment of these buoys happen, but then once the kinds of partners that are using this data.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really fun. I mean, this is where you start getting out into local communities, working with fishing groups, working with counties, cities, universities, and this is really where that technology piece has allowed a whole different tier and organization level to come in. So, historically it was just the federal government. So it had to be decreed from Washington that the Coast Guard cutter was going to put out this big, huge buoy, and that's not the case anymore. So I think we're into a level of applying this technology that we can work with, say, the University of Toledo, train their students how to put this. It's a lot of marine handling. So we got shackles and chain and mooring lines, and we've got scope. So you're really thinking a lot about some marine applications here, and then their buoys measuring harmful algal blooms, and they're pairing that with measurements. So that's kind of a university example. We also, the origin of our program really comes from the University of Michigan, using their engineering department and their naval architecture and marine engineering to design this buoy in the first place. So we've benefited from a university core that helps to do R&D on this technology, and we work to find suppliers and manufacturers that can produce this, and we can assemble it, set it up, test it, and get it deployed. So, I think we support buoys all the way from near Chicago all the way over to Ashtabula, Ohio right now. And every buoy has a different story of who helps put it out, why it's there, where does the data go, who's it helping, is it first a science project, but then we can share the data to boaters for the waves. So I think that collaboration is key, and I think it's bridging this, public-private partnership, like pretty square on the nose. So,
and I love that collaboration happens. That these buoys can help a lot of different people, a lot of different services, and I know that there are a couple of really fun examples that I've seen of how the public are interacting with these buoys. There's the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. They have a really great Twitter feed called Two Yellow Buoys, which is, I guess, their buoys have, video cameras on them. So they're capturing photos or maybe video, and some really amazing data about waves and wind on the lakes. I think it's WOOD TV in Grand Rapids uses theirs in some of their nightly newscasts. So how would a regular person interact with some of these buoys, and bigger picture, how do they help educate the public?
Yeah, if you're a boater or sailor or just lake enthusiast, you can just search Great Lakes buoys and you'll come up with some web links pretty easy. You can search for the city you're near, so Cleveland buoys. Google should have a good quick link for that. There's also wherever you get your weather forecasts for the marine weather forecasts, we share data from all of these buoys with those same outlets. So if you're on a smartphone and you go to your app store and search for NOAA buoy, our data will show up on there. There's also a text message system, which we can sort of post in some of the show notes, where you can send a text message and you can get the buoy data back right away, which is kind of neat. It's just an instant way to sort of communicate back with the buoy via text message. And there's sort of these two, if you're I'd say a recreational user, you might go and access this data directly, but and that might help you decide, hey, it's 5:00. Should I run down to the lake today with my boat, or should I just go home? So there's tons of people are making those decisions. I'm sure it's happening right now. People are thinking like, it looks kind of nice out there. Is it worth it? And they can just go check real quick. They don't have to waste gas and this maybe, and once they're out there, they're like, I just spent all this time and effort. I'm going to go out anyway, and it might not be safe. So I think that's really helped the ordinary non-lakefront beach person from say, hey, should I go to the lake? There's also this whole other impact of these buoys, which is, people's jobs. It is to account for some level of risk of working on the Great Lakes. So we talked about freighters. Previously, they would just have to make stick your finger in the air and, pink sky in the morning, kind of like sailor's advice. And I think this data can help really reduce the risk of them making a decision, which could be, life or death for a whole crew. Data also goes to the U.S. Coast Guard, who has to dispatch crews of people to figure out, hey, there's a boater in distress. which way is the wind blowing? Where are they going? Where should we look first? It's also supporting beach forecast models of bacteria. So we know that under certain wind, wave, and water quality conditions, the beach should probably be closed in the morning. We don't have to wait till the next day after we get a bacteria result back that said, hey, the beach should have been closed yesterday. So I think a lot of ordinary people don't quite know how this data is being used, but the end result is less risk for the people that are entrusted to make those decisions that involve water.
And how do you pick where a buoy goes? Is it just somebody approaches you all and your team and they say, hey, we have some funding and we think we want one here? Or is there I'm just sort of curious how you're making decisions about that, how those get deployed? Because I'm sure there's so many different places and uses that is on a big wish list somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, 10 years ago, with how expensive and relatively few people knew how to work with this, it was really who's going to raise their hand and state the biggest need. And that was, big cities with drinking water, or that was some of the most populated boating areas in the Great Lakes. And there's, one or two federal grants available. When you bring the cost down by 70-80% for this, and you can deploy it on an ordinary boat, you really start changing that answer. And it's still generally been led by the people that want them there. I think, there is no magic line item federal budget that says, here's funding for 100 new buoys or 200 or something. So you're still going to have to work with the sustainability of that asset. And I think that's where I've really enjoyed working with people that want the buoy there in the first place, or say, hey, I think there's enough interest. I think we can do this, because that sort of approach and attitude, it helps with the sustainability. Because the operation and maintenance and cycling in of new technology and keeping data going to the internet, that's certainly the hardest part. Getting a one-time grant to quote get a buoy is only the start. Mm-hmm. And but my personal interest is where do the most people in the Great Lakes fish, drink the water, swim, boat, and that's who we should be serving first, I think. And there's sort of a scientific interest in, the vast expanses of the open waters of northern Lake Huron or Lake Superior, which, we should absolutely understand for climate change. There's a lot of things we're sort of missing with these signals. So there's probably two answers to that. The science, let's let science lead. And then also, where are the people, where's life and property most at risk? And that's generally where I focus my work on.
Yeah. And I'm realizing I didn't ask you how many buoys. You said they're sort of generally from kind of the southern Lake Michigan-ish area over to Ashtabula, Ohio. About how many are there?
Yeah, if we step back to that, what the federal government had back in the all the way up to the early 2000s, there was only 10 buoys in the whole Great Lakes. There was about 10. There was about two per lake is what the federal government funded. Huh. There was a few more from Environment Canada that came along with the Canadian Coast Guard. And then we saw from 2010 to about 2015, we added maybe 10 more. And then from 2015 through to the present, we've added about 60 to 70 more. And most of those are clustering around some university partner, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, University of Minnesota, Duluth. So people that have like a marine program. We've, as a sort of, private operator, we've tended to support smaller universities to have these buoy programs, as well as maintaining and putting out some of our own. So the ones that we put out are about there's about 15 to 20 of them. We added about 10 new ones this year on Lake Erie, and so I'm most interested in now that they're cheaper and we can support whole networks a lot easier than we can just one bigger one by itself. So we just put 10 in Lake Erie, only in the Ohio waters, one for each county. So I think Ohio, from Toledo to Ashtabula, is the most connected, wired, monitored portion of the Great Lakes, which I think that's great. I think the amount of use of the lake, the drinking water, the harmful algal
Mhm.
blooms. So
Yeah. And you were sort of heading there. What's your vision for the future, in 10, 15, 20, 40 years? Like, what would you like to see this become?
yeah, I think, there's, again, two parts to the answer. I think, COVID really revealed how much we had relied on people just being able to observe and be out on the water for some of those risk
Mhm.
things when we were trying to reduce staff and really limit how many people are on call or something. We switched to using technology a lot more, and I don't see that stopping. I see us adding more observations near critical infrastructure, near urban centers that have so many different impacts from water, whether it's erosion or um, water level changes and just that general boating or community interest. So I see that continue. I'm also aware, like, people are losing, I'd say, general curiosity about the
Mhm.
lakes. We can use technology to show people and just keep keep them aware. Hey, it's nice out there today. You should go out there. Here's a webcam image, and really trying to draw those data streams into what people are already sitting time consuming on their phone. So, if you're going to sit and scroll on social media, I want you to see posts about the lake and how great it is today and what everyone else is doing out there. So I think technology allows us to get back into people's lives, be a little bit more relevant with how people just consume and spend their day. So these sensors and technology allow people to feel connected to the lake and to want to get back out there.
And I love that. I know there are a couple of other examples, but I mentioned earlier that Two Yellow Buoys Twitter feed, and every once in a while something pops up on my feed from there that just makes me remember. And we started out talking about this, like how huge and amazing the lakes are, right? Like whether it's data about like, whoa, we had a wave that was this big, or some weather condition that we aren't connected with that on the lakes, just sitting in our apartments or houses or wherever. And I'm always just, every once in a while it pops up and I'm like, oh man, this is a reminder of just how amazing and huge and powerful these lakes are.
Yeah, and I mean, as a person that's been on the water, you kind of know there's these, like, the lakes do weird things, and it's neat to be able to see some of that under the surface behavior. I mean, there are these giant bathtubs and waters. They have tides, the water's moving around. We can see some very interesting things. And it is a challenge that two yellow buoys, they added a third buoy last year. So I think they're
Oh,
they're actually they're
three.
actually three yellow buoys, but I don't think they're going to change their name. But yeah, that connection to people's lives and, communities that are on the water kind of get this
Mm-hmm.
water connection. Uh, and the more we can spread that just fascination, curiosity, I think the better. We've got the Cleveland crib here behind my shoulder. Just a phenomenally cool, like, hey, we're sucking in lake water from 5 miles out. It's traveling miles. The lake's like, it's cold on the bottom, warm on the top. There's all kinds of stuff happening out there, and then it ends up in your tap. So it helps to build this trust back too. And this is one thing that was evident during the Toledo water crisis. These buoys helped restore that trust of we're watching the lake, we know what it's doing,
Mm-hmm.
and that didn't exist before. So I think the more we can help the public respect, understand, and trust that the lakes are big, but there's relatively simple things we can do. We're not going to the moon here. We're just going to put out another buoy. So,
Yeah, one buoy at a time. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Ed, for talking with us today. And we have lots of links and resources that we'll put on the Lakes Chat webpage, greatlakes.org/lakeschat. So thanks so much again, Ed, for chatting with us today. Appreciate it.
yeah, thank you, Jennifer. My pleasure. Always happy to talk about buoys.